Welcome to this week's episode of The Formula, where we break down and explore the elements of achievement in world-class performers. I'm your host, Trevor Carlson, and today I am really excited to interview a mentor of mine who's had a huge impact on my life. Fark.com founder, Drew Curtis. He's got a ton of experience, from running an internet service provider to running for governor of Kentucky and running Fark.com for almost 20 years. I really enjoyed this interview. We had a lot of fun, and I really hope you enjoy it too.
I'm Drew Curtis. I born and raised and still live in Kentucky. And I'm a Luther College grad, which is relevant to people in the Iowa area who don't realize that I've got pretty strong ties to the area. Actually, it was my home for 3 years when I was in college. And it was only 3 because I spent 1 year in England working on virtual reality in 1993, because that's how my life works. But at any rate, I moved back to Kentucky after college, started a couple of businesses that did pretty well for a little while. And like one of them was an ISP, and those did pretty well until the telcos decided they wanted all that action, and they came in and they took it. But we had a good 6-year run. Then it allowed me to start Fark by complete accident, because I couldn't have afforded the hosting costs back in 1999 when I got it going. So Fark, basically, people keep asking, if you're not familiar with it, it's basically the easiest explanation is it's what if the Daily Show ran the Drudge Report. And it's an online community based around real news, but making it funny. So very much like the Daily Show, I guess. And we've been around for about 18 years now. We'll be 20 years old in 2019, and that's coming up in 18 months, I think. So
That's really impressive, though. I mean, are you guys the oldest or longest lasting community online at this point in time?
No, I don't think so, because there's actually been a few that predated. So like Slashdot definitely was around before us. Metafilter might have been around before us. I don't know. But even before that, I've discovered that there's ones even older than that. Like there was The Well, which I think was the first online internet community. And then I came across a couple others that predate back to like 1990 that started on, BBSs that weren't connected, and they're still around. So we're not the oldest, but there's not many older, mostly because most communities don't make it that long. Yeah.
And we'll get into that a little bit later about why those communities don't last. But you kind of touched on this a little bit, but, how did you start Fark and why?
Yeah, so I started it in 1999. I was actually thinking of 2 ideas for our website. One was a curry recipe database, because in 1999 there was only one other good one, and that seemed like a market opportunity. But the other one is I always had sort of a penchant for finding the oddball stories. And I have to explain this now in a way that I didn't used to, but it used to be hard to find weird offbeat stuff, which younger folks probably would be surprised to hear, because the news cycle now is pretty much full of it. Like it's almost all, CNN basically does almost exactly the same thing we do. They just pretend to be legitimate at this point. So the news ecosystem has changed dramatically. So at the time, that was something I also liked, and I would always find these weird articles. And so I just decided to create a website to post them to, my friends, because I thought emailing them would be really annoying. So, and that's how it took off. And then just step by step over the years, it got a little bigger and a little bigger and a little bigger. And in 2000, just to teach myself how to code, I added comments to the site. So it wasn't just a reading experience. And that's when the community started, was June of 2000 was when the comments went live.
So how did you get from 2000, where the comments just went live, to where Fark is at now, where I guess maybe tell us where Fark is at, like give us an update on how much it's grown and how much things have changed since then, and then kind of talk about the process of going from, your first few users to where you are now.
Yeah, so we were never really huge, actually, and right now we're about a third of the size we were at our height, which was right back around 2009. And part of the reason for that is attention deficit. There's only so much time people have to waste during the day, and algorithmic social media sites have really sucked up a lot of that, because there's just not that much time to waste. I was trying to explain this to my son the other day, because he overheard me tell that to somebody else. He's like, how does that work? And I was like, okay, how much time do you spend screwing around all day? And he's like, I don't know. And I was like, well, okay, so we know it's not 24 hours because you got to sleep. So that means we know it's not, but it's 16 hours because you go to school. So you have 8 hours left, and let's say you got to eat, you got to do your homework, you got to do whatever, that's it, and then you watch TV sometimes. It's maybe 5 or 4, and that's probably being really generous. And if something else comes along that, algorithmically burrows into your brain to the point where you can't put it down, other things are going to suffer. And the easier things to get rid of suffer first. And so in our case, comedic news is not really something that has a super broad appeal. I mean, it turns out that most of the people that are interested in this conversation are going to think, that seems silly, but it turns out most people don't really care about the news. So as a result, I mean, that's why the Daily Show isn't outdrawing CNN, for example. They've never beat CNN in ratings, and everybody knows about them. But it turns out as a product, it's limited by the number of people who would actually care about it. So, but we're at 1 million and change uniques a month and 20 to 25 million page views, depending on what's going on. And actually, lately in the last 6 months, we've been ticking back up. And when I've been talking to people, the reason why they've been coming back, it's either people who have already knew about us or just found us, but people are realizing that they want an online experience that doesn't grab them like a heroin addiction, that they can actually walk away from and put down. And they're realizing that this is a big problem. And so they're trying to find a way to disconnect yet stay informed. And it turns out that my site kind of, performs that function. We're not as addictive as other places are, and we're not trying to keep you around all day long. Because honestly, I don't know how to do it, and it seems like it's kind of uncool anyway.
All right.
But what's happened over the years is we've gone through many, many, many cycles of change. I mean, I would have to say that, this is just a complete guess, but the makeup of the community probably is completely changes itself. I'd say like 95% about every 3 to 4 years, just due to, people's life changes. They find it, they like it for a while, they get busy. The most common path we found is that people have a job where they're not doing anything, find our website, hang out on it for quite a bit, get a promotion, don't have any time for it anymore and go away. And then they get another promotion where all of a sudden they have plenty of time and they come back. So you have this really odd sort of cycle, but it's constantly renewing itself over and over again.
So what was the experience of starting your first business like?
It was really strange. I have a completely separate talk I give on how to function as an entrepreneur in a family where you don't have any relatives who are entrepreneurs. Because most people who are entrepreneurs have somebody in their family, and that's generally how they do it. Because, otherwise, if you don't have anybody in your family that's an entrepreneur, everything you suggest that you're about to do sounds insane. And it's really hard to convince people like, yeah, I'm going to quit my job and I'm going to open up a company that does dial-up internet service, which is a technology that nobody uses right now, but I'm pretty sure they will, and spend all this money doing it and work 16 hours a day. And all your friends and family are like, that sounds completely crazy. What the hell's wrong with you? You really need somebody around you who can be like, no, you're on the right track.
Yeah.
My problem was I never had that. The best I had is there was a guy who ran a comic book store around the corner from me. He got into it. He wasn't a comic book guy, but his son was, and it started as a hobby. And then in his mid-50s, he got laid off. And he was an engineer, and you have a hard time getting hired because in your mid-50s, you're really expensive.
Yeah.
And people right out of college are almost as good. And so he had nothing else to do. So he went and he started working on the comic book store full time, even though it was losing money. And what happened is that when he did that, the comic book store revenues went up by 10x. And he was instrumental because he didn't give me a lot of advice, but he gave me the piece of advice that I needed the most, which was when I was starting my business, I was doing it on the side, working full time. And 6 months in, it wasn't making enough money to pull me on full time. And I talked to him about it, and he told me that story. And he said the moral of that story is that he's like, your business, by the time you need to get on your business full time, it will still not be able to afford you. You have to jump anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And if I don't know what I would have done if I hadn't heard that advice. I mean, maybe I would have done it anyhow, but I still remember that thinking, okay, well then if this is what has to be done, then here we go. And it's true. I mean, actually, you can't run a business part-time and have it succeed unless you get stupid lucky. And if that happens, that business is so easy and so full of cash that larger operators than you are going to move in and knock you out pretty soon. So either way, the upshot is that, you have to jump in. But I didn't have anybody I could talk to about this stuff. I mean, I was working and aside from the fact that it was is a technology that, wasn't, well, I mean, to me, it was going to take off, but you couldn't convince anybody else back in 1996 that this was a slam dunk. Um, and then running Fark was the same way. I mean, I live in Kentucky. I didn't know anybody in the digital space. I didn't meet anybody who had any experience I could draw on until at least 2006. So I was like 10 years down the road at that point, being an entrepreneur. I was 32 years old before I met anybody that I could actually ask questions and get answers from. So I just kind of muddled through and took guesses. And for the most part, I got them right. And other things I got completely wrong, and just learned and kept going.
Yeah. That's an interesting story. I'd never heard the part about the comic book guy before, but would you say he was like your first mentor that you had, or somebody that you kind of looked up to?
That was probably the only thing he told me that ever mattered, because other than that, he was an interesting guy, but as far as the rest of it went, what I was doing was so different from what he was doing. He just kind of threw that out there as their experience, so that was about it. So he wasn't, unfortunately, not a mentor. Like, the story of my experience is very different from most people's. I can't actually point to anybody that I would have considered a mentor. I met somebody who was extremely knowledgeable in 2006, who I'm still really good friends with, that I could bounce stuff off of. But he wasn't exactly a mentor either. He was more of a gut check at that point, because I was so far down the road. Like, I was successful at that stage. So I guess that's more of a coaching position than a mentor, if that makes any sense. But yeah, I wish I'd had one, because it would have been a tons easier.
Absolutely. I mean, I would say that as far as like mentorship goes, I've been very, very fortunate, just because of, I when I got started, I didn't know any better, so I was just like, hey, I have no idea what I'm doing. This person looks like they're doing a really good job at it. What do I need to learn to get from where I'm at now to
Yeah,
where you're at?
that's perfect. And the problem I had was the things I was doing, nobody else was doing them. So,
Yeah,
for example, in 1999, if I need advice on how to run an online community, there's nobody there, or internet
yeah,
service providers. The only people who knew how to do them were my competition, and they weren't going to tell me. So it's been a weird spot to be in. Like, I was telling people, and I think this is going in the book I'm writing, but one of my sort of weird things that happens to me in life is I tend to start working in fields or areas 2 years too early consistently. And most of the time that means dead on arrival. Once in a while you get a big hit out of the park. And I can't tell you, like, I'm just going to claim it because it just keeps happening over and over again, but I'm not really sure how that ends up being something I jump into, because it's not like I'm looking for it. And in fact, most cases when I start working on it, it's just because it's interesting. I don't realize that it's about ready to blow up.
yeah. So, which brings me to like how you learn these different types of lessons, like how you get better as a, whether it's running an online community or as an entrepreneur. From what it sounds like, it's almost like you're saying the best way to learn is just to kind of like jump in, start making mistakes, and then kind of adjust as you go. Hopefully, not make too many mistakes, but
Yeah, right. Well, sort of. I would adjust that slightly and say it would be better if you could find somebody who could tell you along the way whether or not you're on the right track or not, because that would be the better way to do it. But in lieu of that, don't just sit around and wait. If you can't find anybody who can tell you the answer, then just take a shot. It's not the best way, but it's the only path sometimes.
yeah, I think that totally makes sense. It's one of those things where it's like the only way you actually find the right path is by like trying out a few different ones.
Mm-hmm.
It helps if somebody can say like, no, don't do that.
Yeah. Yeah, if somebody actually
or
knows what you should do, then that helps. But there will be times where nobody has any idea, and then at that point, the worst thing to do would be just sit there and do nothing. But you have to be careful trying that stuff too, because like, one of the things about Fark. So, for example, here's a sort of a best practice I've adopted, which is basically anytime a new technology platform, social media, whatever. I mean, we've seen hundreds of these things in the last 18 years pops up. I don't jump on them immediately. I wait because I don't have enough resources to try every new thing that comes along. And to give you an example, it was 2008 or 2009. I went over to the New York Times, and I don't know if they still have this or not, but I was getting a little tour, and they had a room where they had literally every handheld device, one of each. And there were people in there testing the New York Times platform on every single one of those. And my problem is I can't do that, And not only that, we can be sure that of all the devices in that room, only one or two are going to be the relevant platforms. So my thing was like, instead of, doing the same thing they did and getting, buying all those devices and hiring a team of 50 people to code, compliant, platforms for each one of those devices, I decided to sit back and wait. It was clear that mobile was going to take off, but what was not clear was how it was going to do it. My gut was is that iPhones were going to be a big thing, but if I had to take another guess back in 2009, I'd have said BlackBerry, and I would have been wrong. So, and it would have cost me a lot of money to go down that road and find out, whoops, that was the wrong call. Or, a lot of people made tablet platforms back in 2009 and 2010. And I don't think that's a dead end technology, but it wouldn't have paid off for the last 7 years if we'd done that. So because I don't have the resources, sometimes it is better to sit and wait a little bit. But the thing is, it doesn't matter if you're first, second, or third, but it does matter that you get there at some point. So you can be a little late to the game and still crank along okay, but you can't be a lot late. So that's sort of that's all, you got to do something balanced against the cost of being wrong. And so you got to take educated guesses after a while. And there's some things that I missed that I would have liked to take a shot at and didn't quite work out. Like I would have liked to gotten into the mobile side of things sooner than we did. But part of the reason we didn't was because there was no market case for it. So even still, we make practically nothing off of mobile, but now it's clear that in the next few years, there will be money. But even currently today, it's not that great.
Right. So I'm thinking back to a couple of years ago when right after you spoke at the University of Northern Iowa, I was working on a mobile app startup at the time, and I was going through some growing pains as I was learning like how getting a mobile app startup off the ground actually worked. And I sent you an email and I asked you for advice on a couple different things. I felt like when you responded to my email, you put a lot of time and thought into it, and it was actually like completely opposite of what everyone else told me. So what advice would you give to those starting their own business today?
Yeah, there's tons of answers to that question. I'm trying to think on the really basic stuff. Like I said, the first one would be is if you don't come from a family of entrepreneurs, be ready for pushback. Lots of pushback. The short answer to the talk that I gave is basically the number one reason not to do something is because it's safer not to do it. But people who are employed by other organizations are not in a safer position. They are as precarious as anybody. They just don't realize it. And in fact, it doesn't really pay to tell them because they start getting freaked out. But my point is like, it doesn't matter how loyal you are to your company. If they have a bad quarter, they're going to cut you. They don't care. That's just how it is. They're not going to, and because of that, it's like, so that to me doesn't seem safer. That means that if I put all this work and this loyalty into a thing and I get literally nothing back for that, well, it's like, well, hold on. How much safer is this exactly? So that's sort of the beginning one is like, just realize that you are taking a risk, but at the end of the day, the worst thing that can happen is bankruptcy. And that may sound a little flip, but it's honestly not bad. I mean, I've never done it, don't get me wrong, but it's not a permanent, it's not like losing an arm, like this isn't it sucks a lot, but this isn't a permanent death blow. You can come back from it. I know a guy that spent 20 years working on multiple businesses, and his fifth one was the one that took off, but the other four resulted in bankruptcy and just bad stuff. But at the end of the day, he looked back and he's like, but it wasn't that bad. He thought it was at the time, but it wasn't the disaster that he thought it was. So it's one of those deals where you don't have a lot to lose. It's still worth taking a shot. Don't get me wrong. At the same time, I wouldn't say just go out there and throw all caution to the wind and go for it. Figure out what your worst case scenario is. And then go from there. To give you an example, and you may be surprised to figure it out. So like your worst case scenario for yourself might be, well, I have to go get another job. Well, if you know where you would do that, then that's kind of all you need. If it's like, okay, if I got to close this thing up next week, declare bankruptcy, but I can get another job and get X amount of salary and come back from that, then go for it. You're good. So just one of those things where you got to make sure that, all your ducks are in a row, but don't spend a lot of time on it. Just sort of figure out, sort of what's the worst that could happen and go from there. After that is you need a partner. You can go it alone, but you're going to need help from people who have the skills you don't. And in particular, from the entrepreneur side, I noticed this is an observation I picked up in business school is that entrepreneurs usually come in twos because You need one person who's the one who's sort of the visionary, the idea person, and the one who drives it forward. And you need the other person who's basically the COO, the person who covers the ops side of things and figures out how to make it all work. Because, and I like to use the example of Steve Jobs. If you look at the Steve Jobs career path, Steve Jobs without a COO is just a crazy asshole, and he couldn't get anything done. As long as he had Wozniak at Apple, it was great. Wozniak left, things start going downhill, and he gets bounced out of there. And then he finds what's his name, Lasseter, I think it was, and then he does Pixar, and that works great. And basically then he picks up Tim Cook, but as a COO. But Jobs without a COO was just some guy screaming at people, and he did not know how to make a company run, and he had no idea how to do it. And I feel like COOs get a bad rap because they don't get any publicity. But on the other hand, that might be what you want. I mean, it turns out a lot of people don't mind being behind the scenes because the COO is not the person on the conference call with the investors. So it's not a bad deal. But you need two, and you can maybe have three, but one of those people is going to leave almost certainly, and you just got to be ready for it. For example, I know a company that I'm working with that has 5 founders on it, and they don't all. It's not an even split. And they don't care, and the other 3 guys are kind of keeping it going, but because they don't have that much of a stake in it, they're less interested. So they're starting to look around and where they can float their resumes and jump to. So it's one of those deals where it can be, you can have a silent money person, but just understand that only 2 of you are likely to be active in this thing long term. You might get lucky, but that's probably how it's going to go. As far as starting stuff up goes, you want to do all the boring stuff. You want to make sure all your documents are done. You want your articles of corporation, all that stuff that you can find in any book. You want to make sure you get that stuff nailed down. You can do it yourself. Just be ready to change it later, because whatever you do initially is going to suck. It's not going to suck badly or be damaged, but if something actually starts working, you're going to want to have a stronger operating agreement than whatever you come up with in the beginning. So that's something to look out for too. And I'm trying to think. There's a couple of other early issues with it. I'm trying to think of what order to hit them in. One of the ones I was thinking of talking about that group of 5 guys is that if you take money in from an investor, and it's probably going to be friends of yours initially, the way you want to do it is you want to make sure that you don't give away more than 20%. And the reason why, and this actually you can explain it to them, Silicon Valley doesn't take more than 20% on an investment either. And the reason they don't is because they learned a long time ago, if they take more, the founders get disinterested and they leave. So it turns out if you go up over 25%, you've actually just killed the company, because the founders, no matter how excited they are initially, are going to walk off. And it's fascinating to me that, because Silicon Valley could always ask for 90%, right? But they don't, because they learned that that's just a terrible idea. So if you're taking money from other people, make sure that they know that that's the deal. And also make sure they know that they're probably setting fire to it, because they probably are. Get everybody's minds in the right place. You don't want somebody to invest in your company expecting a huge return. Maybe they will, but probably this is just gone. So don't worry about it. I'm trying to think what else as far as like beginning stuff goes too. One other thing would be to train your people that you're working with to not say no to anything, but try to find a way to say yes. And this is sort of a subtle difference. This isn't having them agree with everything you decide to do, but your other people might start dragging their feet. Really, don't ever accept, no, we can't. Could we do this? And if it turns out, how could we do this is, oh, well, if we hired another 100 people who were amazing at this thing and we had some incredible stroke of luck that we could totally pull this off, okay, then maybe we shouldn't do it. That's what I mean. So no, it's an improv comedy trick. Actually, if you've ever done improv comedy on the stage, you're always supposed to say yes and in your responses. And you want to train people that you're working with to start thinking in terms of yes and as opposed to no.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting lesson, because that I had a remote worker previously, or I think it was a remote worker. I was like, hey, can you get this stuff? Can you figure out how to do this? If I send you some training videos, can you sort this out? And this person would always be like, no, I don't know how to do that. I'm like, but it's pretty easy to like, Google it and figure it out.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and on top of it too, it's like, most people are actually trying to tell you is that, it's very unlikely that we'll succeed at whatever the thing you're talking to. But yeah, of course. Like that's the whole point. It is exactly highly unlikely that you're going to succeed, but the reason you're doing this is because you're trying. So it's very, if you get the wrong combination of people, you can talk yourself out of making any steps at all. Even if you, the person who runs the company, still wants to take it forward, you can have an entire team of people that just tells you no because they, and I realized this a few years ago where I had somebody on my crew who was doing that. And part of the reason is because when you're doing software design, it's always tricky when you add new functionality because adding new functionality is either the easiest damn thing in the world or a goddamn nightmare. And the problem is that if you keep encountering that coin flip, you start not wanting to do anything. And so I totally understand it. But at the end of the day, it was like, okay, look, I get it, but we got to push through this. And one of the things that will come up probably is one of the objections will be that's not what this company does. And that is actually the most useless argument that anybody can possibly make. Because the reason why is this. If you look at the example of Nintendo, so in like 1875, Nintendo is a paper company. And they eventually moved into playing cards. In the 1960s, they owned hotels and taxi cabs, and now they're a video game company. The reason why they've been around almost 150 years is because we don't do this as our business was something that they shot down. I mean, I don't know exactly how it worked out, but I mean, if you think about the conversion of starting out as a paper company ending up in video games, which in 1875 you couldn't even explain to people. And the reason they did was because they realized that, and this is sort of a general rule for business, if you and your team can do literally any other business better than the one you're currently working on, you should totally morph into that.
So when you gave the talk at UNI, you talked about failing fast and what that meant to you. You kind of touched on what it meant in business and what it meant in relationships as well. So you want to kind of rehash that a little bit again on what failing fast means to you?
Yeah, so the failing fast thing, the thing it definitely isn't is failing a lot. Like nobody wants to do that. It would be better if you never did. The running joke in Silicon Valley as of a couple of years ago was the term pivot was actually I was talking to some VCs about it and they hate that word. And the reason why is because they're like, ideally, you don't pivot at all. You come out with the thing that's awesome and it works. And they said the problem was that they felt like the pivot was being used as an excuse too often to just justify failure, which they didn't like. And so it's not that you want to fail, but it's one of those deals where using relationships is a better example. Everybody's got friends who have been dating somebody or married to somebody for 2 or 3 years and it's just not going well. Like, it's not bad. It's not abusive, but they don't like hanging out with them like at all. Like everything's just sort of like, it's not a good situation. And at least when you're dating, pulling the cord on that, while hard, is not going to be this massive mess like a divorce might be. I mean, divorces are always nasty. Even a good one is terrible. And so is ending your relationship with your business. But the thing about it is that a lot of people that in my circle have hung in on relationships for far too long because they thought everybody else would think that they gave up too soon. And in reality, everybody else was sitting around going, oh God, this is a tragedy that they're still doing this. If your business is failing, all of your friends are sitting around thinking, oh my God, this is a tragedy that they're still doing this. I guarantee it. You will get no points for staying in long or as long as possible. Nobody cares. Everybody just feels bad for you. I had a friend of mine who went through that. Her business failed for about 2.5 years. And it was obvious 2 years before that actually failed that this was what was going to happen. And she hung in anyway because that was her personality. But at the end of it, she was like, yeah, I got nothing out of it. And they're like, yeah, there's no trophies for this either. Nobody's impressed. It's like,
yeah,
I wouldn't have, I told her that, in the meantime, what she could have done with all that energy was, start up something else and, maybe get a good head start on it. But the only time I would say that somebody should stay in a failing business, by the way, and I actually did this with somebody in my MBA class, was sometimes you'll learn something on the way down just from watching. And in particular, it was a gal who was essentially the unnamed COO of the company, and it had 2 founders that were just not working out, and this thing was starting to death spiral. And I told her, I was like, you know what? I was like, if you eventually want to start your own company, I recommend, as long as the paycheck clears, stay in and watch and take notes and learn what not to do. So that would be about the only time I would say you ought to stick around. But otherwise, just get out because nobody's impressed.
Right.
And it's not a good use of your time. So going back to the relationship analogy, I had another friend who developed what I think is the most amazing dating strategy ever. I was just blown away by this. So she would, she didn't even realize she was doing this until I pointed it out, but she was on a 3 week cycle. So week one was just met this person. They're kind of awesome. Things are great. Week two is we're hanging out. Things are going great. And then by the beginning of week three, it was kind of like, well, yeah. So now that that new relationship energy thing is done, it's like, yeah, I don't know about this. And then by week three, she'd be like, yeah, it doesn't feel right. I'm not. And her thing was more like, it's not that she couldn't make it work. It was just that it was going to be more effort than she was willing to put in. And I don't disagree with that because relationships and businesses are the same. It's like, while having a successful relationship or business is a lot of work, it doesn't have to seem like it. Or put another way, my wife once gave me crap because in an interview, I told people I worked an hour and a half a week. And she said, I feel like I do today, even still. But she pointed out, she goes, just because you like it doesn't make it not work. And I was like, oh, yeah, that's a good point. That's how relationships and businesses should be. It should be a lot of work, but you shouldn't care. If it starts feeling like work, then you get some problems. Either step out or pull the cord and be done.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice. That's very good advice, man. My gears are spinning a little bit after that. So, but how do you decipher between, this is like a non-starter, like you need to get out, like this thing is going down. Like how do you decipher between like normal business or relationship stuff that can cause stress and anxiety compared to the
Right.
stuff that's like this thing is going to burn down and you need out.
Yeah. Right. Well, the relationship analogy, I don't know how this fits on the business side, but the relationship analogy is it doesn't matter why you care that something is not fun. It could be completely irrational, but it still matters and it's not going away. And a lot of times you can't get around it. That's probably the same for business, but with business, there's an extra step of part of the problem with being an entrepreneur is that by definition, you were probably an insane optimist. And then otherwise you would have never tried this stuff. And the problem with being an insane optimist is you can miss market changes occasionally. Like I always tell people that in business, your reaction to any bad negative event ought to be, we can work with this, even if it's completely ridiculously bad. I tell the story of a friend of mine who was an attorney, he was a public defender, and he said he had his client get up on the stand, and the first question that the prosecution asked his client was, "Did you kill this guy?" And the guy said, "Yeah, I did." And he stood up and he threw an objection without having any idea what he was actually going to object to at the time. And he said, "As God is my witness," he said, "I swear to God, the first thought through my head was, we can still work through this." So that's pretty much an entrepreneur mentality right there. But at the end of the day, sometimes you can't. And so in order to do this, and I don't know how to give people advice because this is sort of a personality thing, but you have to at least occasionally reflect like, okay, what is really going on here in the business environment? In case in point, so my first business was a dial-up internet service provider. In 1996, this was a really good thing. But in 2002, when things started going south, that was very hard. I spent a lot of time running from looking at that and just thinking, okay, well, this will just get miraculously better, or this downturn is going to end somehow. If you can't answer the question how it's going to end, that's when you might want to take a good hard look at it. And in my case, what happened is that it was clear that internet service was moving to DSL and cable. DSL was too expensive for us to run. Cable was a non-starter. We couldn't even get into it. And there was no chance of more people suddenly signing up for dial-up internet. And so looking at that was like, okay, this is probably done. And so that's what you have to do. You have to be extremely honest with yourself, and that's going to be the hardest thing in the world because as an optimist, you're going to want to run. The other way to do it is if you're the CEO and you have a good COO, the person who takes care of stuff, they're probably dying to tell you should get the hell out of it. So it might be good to talk to them because they're the ones that have to keep an eye on that kind of thing, and they can see the negatives too better than you can.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's man, I think that's some really, really good advice. Just from business and relationships in general. And I think that's something that a lot of people pass up is like, they're like, you just got to grind it out and struggle. It's like, well, not always.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff that we believe that we were told that just kind of sticks in our head and forget to question it. Like the whole issue of like every entrepreneur knows that the thing fed to the working man, the just do the right thing and work hard and you'll be rewarded, is just utter bullshit, and it's a complete lie. We need to re-examine occasionally because somebody else told us those things hoping we would believe them for their benefit. And one of those is, staying in and sticking it out and working really hard. Well, that benefits the boss, but doesn't necessarily make your quality of life go up. And like I said, the other way to look at it is that maybe you can't tell yourself not to work hard. That's cool. But the other point being, nobody's impressed on the other side of it. You're not going to get a trophy for it. Nobody's going to be like, hey, great job hanging in that crappy relationship for 5 years.
Yeah.
Man, you should have gone for 6. Nobody's going to tell you that. And the same thing goes for business as well. So that's realizing that there is no upside to hanging in longer, I think, is the helpful point there.
Yeah. I think that's some good advice. And man, they need to be playing that. People need to be playing that soundbite you just did there quite a bit. Just it makes me hurt on the inside when I see people suffer, right? Like unnecessarily.
Yeah.
And it's whether it's a business or relationship, and it's like, what's that meme with the dog with the house on fire, and he's like drinking the coffee.
Yeah,
he's like, no, everything's fine. It's like everybody can see the house burning down except for them.
Yeah, exactly. Like I said, it's hard as an entrepreneur to figure that out because we are stupid optimists. So we're gonna be the last people that notice it. But it's one of those deals where you have to once in a while just take a look at pragmatically, is this thing going to last? And I've had to do that with Fark, for example, because, up until recently, traffic was going down and revenues have been tough because of the way the ad market works. But on the other hand, it's still highly valued by a lot of people. And I'm writing a book, and without it, I would be spending 4 hours a day doing research. But because of what I do, I'm spending 0 hours a day doing research because I'm just finding this stuff automatically. So there's still significant value there. And so it's one of those deals where it's questionable what's going to happen with the revenue side of things in the long term, but I'm not without options at this point. So now if I had looked up and found no options, then I would pull the plug on this thing tomorrow. But there's other stuff in the works. The market changes relatively quickly. I've got balls moving, basically, like very specific ones, rather than. So I'm not just operating on hopes here. There's like stuff happening. So
right.
It's one of those deals where, but you have to take a look and go, okay, am I really right about this? Should we just yank this or what?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm interested to see what happens because with you because I'm sure that you got something really interesting cooking. So I'll be excited.
Always, yeah. Well, that's the thing. And to give it sort of a more specific example, it's like the spot we're in right now has to do with the way the ad market is changing. Everybody wants to do autoplay video ads, and whenever the ad market makes a stupid decision like this, it takes them about 18 months to realize. So until they figure that out, we have to ride out this storm. And so it's one of those deals where, okay, I immediately put 12 balls in motion, and it turns out that most of them are in different stages of working out. So it's one of those deals where that's what you do. You don't try one thing, you try many, and then hopefully most of them pan out. And if they don't, as long as you got one that's going to totally work and carry the day, you're good. And so that's kind of where we're at right now.
Yeah. Well, yeah, like I said, I'm excited to see what happens, and knowing you, I'm sure that everything is going to work out fine. So where do you see the biggest benefit from somebody investing time in building an online community right now?
Yeah, so I've been thinking a lot about this because I actually had somebody locally contact me who wanted to build a community for a very specific reason, which I found fascinating. We'll get more into sort of how communities are built, but generally speaking, communities are all here for a thing. And so depending on what that thing is, that's kind of the value. They're good for getting a message out, and they're good for making a thing more interesting. And to give you an example, so this guy comes and contacts me, and he wants to create a community because he's rarely in his social media coming across insightful, nonpartisan political articles that will allow him to understand issues, because nobody's writing them. They exist, but they're not out there. They don't tend to get a lot of social lift because people aren't like, yay, neutrality. It's hard to get excited on. This is a well thought out, well reasoned, controversial look at a topic. Yay. So he wants to find a way to create a community where he can do that because he realizes that Facebook and Twitter aren't really the spots for it. And I thought that's an interesting goal that he has. I'm actually kind of interested in it too. So one of the benefits of it is that the thing you pick, whatever it is that you're excited about, allows you to share it with more people in a better way, basically, and find more like-minded folks. So I think that's the main one there. And then after that, it's to get information out. Like what this guy wants to do. He wants to basically, use like a Fark-like platform and post articles that are specifically well thought out and well reasoned that friends of both political persuasions can read.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that makes total sense. So I would probably say you're one of the wittiest people I've ever met. How did you get to be so witty?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, it was probably there all along. I retroactively looking backwards, what I like about it the most now is it's humor unlocks people's brains in ways that arguments don't, especially in politics. And I think the answer to that question is that I'm always in a hurry to try to get through stuff, and possibly the reason for that might be that using humor gets points across quicker. But I can't say that it was an intentional decision.
You're just born that way.
Yeah, pretty much. So I don't know. Yeah, I definitely think sideways though. Like I like to analyze problems from all angles, and specifically things people haven't thought of. And it turns out that comedy aligns very well with that. Because usually, like when you break down what it is, it's really we laugh because it is something we haven't thought of in a way we didn't think of it. That's pretty much what makes you laugh. So as a result, that's kind of how my brain works anyway. And I guess that's probably it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting way to put it because, yeah, looking at things a little bit sideways does make them, I don't know, at least a little bit more ridiculous. Because they're like, wait a minute,
Yeah.
I never thought about it like that.
Yeah, exactly. Like I said, I think that comedy is the perfect way to package payloads of actual ideas.
Yeah. So what do you do in your free time for fun when you're not working your hour and a half a week on Fark?
Yeah, it depends. I'm a very social guy, so I get out a lot. I've been trying to take up cycling, which takes up a bunch of time, and then kids, of course, obviously those guys are around, and they're older, so at this point it's more like you kind of hang out until they want to do something, as opposed to setting agendas and whatever. But that's okay. So, and yeah, I have a bunch of other weird, unrelated projects that I'm always working on. I'm always thinking about stuff. So, I can't specifically think of. I'm still sort of dabbling on the political side. I'm still writing a book. I'm still advising people on startups. So it's pretty varied, but that's kind of how I like to roll.
Yeah, always on your toes, doing something new. So what's something that you've learned this week?
This week, oh man, there's been a bunch of stuff. Well, the most recent thing I learned was like how I don't ever ask people what they do, because I'm not really that interested in it. And I told my friend that. I was like, yeah, I really don't care what people do. And he said, no, you do care what people do. You just don't care how they make their money. And I was like, yeah, okay, that's right. So that's something I learned this week, is that he's absolutely right about that. I don't care how people make their money. I do care what people do.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's ever since
it's an interesting distinction.
Yeah, ever since that you said that, where it's like people who don't actually give a shit what you do ask what you do. Like, you know what I mean? They're like trying to figure out what you do so they can benefit themselves.
Yeah, exactly. Because that's what the sort of the question he says is that when they ask you what do you do, most of the time people are asking you how do you make your money, and specifically how much money do you have, because they're social climbing. This is a bigger problem in larger cities like New York and San Francisco, where it's literally the first question that gets asked, specifically because if you don't give a satisfactory answer, they're just out of there. So that's one of the deals there.
Yeah.
It was a question I never asked because I wasn't as interested in that as I was, how cool is this person?
Yeah.
And then later on, what it would be interesting and more informative. But it's a lot of fun to learn who people are before you know what they do or how successful they are, because that makes a big difference.
Yeah, it's one of my biggest pet peeves is when, well, I shouldn't say it's a pet peeve. It's just, it makes me very uncomfortable when the first time I meet someone, they look at me and they're like, so what do you do? And I'm like, I don't want to talk about work at all. So,
well, actually, so you could say that. You'd be like, I'll tell you later.
Yeah.
But right now I'm kind of over it. I'm off the clock.
Yeah. Yeah. The two answers I've been using recently have been like, oh, well, I'm a janitor. And then it's like, and then they're like, oh, I'm like, and then they're like, oh, so what do you do for fun? I'm like, there we go. All right, we'll move past that. Or I'll say like,
yeah. So this is the person we're talking to. Yeah.
Yeah. And then, or I'll say something like, well, I salsa dance for fun, so that's kind of what I do. And then they're like, "Oh,
There you go.
tell me more." I actually
Yeah.
I got a meeting with somebody. I didn't even realize who they were, and they asked me that, and I was like, "Oh, I just salsa dance and do stuff." And they're like, "You salsa dance? You don't look like a salsa dancer." I'm like, "Hey, I do what I can." And
Yeah.
turns out that person owned a pretty decently sized company, and we're meeting up next week and grabbing a coffee to talk about some opportunities to work together. So it's like,
Yeah.
the email I sent him was like, "Hey, I'm the dude that salsa dances. You want to grab coffee still?" And
Yeah. Exactly. They won't forget.
right. So it's like, I don't know. It's we kind of talked about it earlier. I think it's just being like your authentic self. Like not everybody just wants to talk
Yeah.
about work and shit all the time. So you became an entrepreneur in your late 20s or so. But my question for you is
Early 20s, actually, right out of college.
early
Yeah.
20s. So
Yeah.
so what did you want to be when you grew up?
I'm trying to think. When I was a kid, I don't actually know. When I was when I was a teenager, it went from I was really good at math, and so I was thinking about doing math something. But then I wanted to be a writer when I was in high school. I actually wrote a book before I graduated high school. It's not very good, but it was 720 pages long. It was a big book. Um, so I thought I might want to be a writer for a while, but I was like, that just seemed too impossibly hard to break into. And writing's fun, but I don't know. It wasn't one of the things that just grabbed my attention. And then in college, I started out being a history major until I was like, well, I can't figure out what to do with this exactly. And then I found computer science by total accident and liked it, and was like, well, something I like that I make a lot of money doing. Okay, I should probably stick with this. So that's kind of how that happened. But I don't remember. I remember I wanted to do something really cool, crazy, deep sciencey stuff when I was younger. Like I remember thinking about like nuclear engineering would be interesting, or genetic engineering. But then when I read into them, it just didn't seem that interesting after all. It sounded like it would be fun to say you're a nuclear engineer, but actually doing it, not that interesting. So yeah.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, that is a wrap. If you would be so kind, you will find a link down in the show notes. That link is going to take you over to iTunes, where, if you'd like to, you can give us a 5-star review. Now, giving us a 5-star review helps us to rise up in the ranks on iTunes and for people like you to be able to find our show. Also, if you have any ideas for anyone you would like to hear us interview, please feel free to shoot me an email, trevor@helixacademy.co, or jump over to the Twitter sphere, where you can shoot us a little message at Helix Academy CO. Thanks again for tuning in this week, and I look forward to seeing you or having you tune in to listen next week. Thanks, everybody.